So today we're just going to do a quick development postmortem. Obviously 20 minutes is a pretty short amount of time to cover a postmortem on a project that lasted 18 months. But we'll run through a few things, and if you want a little bit more detail on anything, just grab me afterwards. I'll be happy to grab coffee and chat about a few things. So first of all, I just want to talk about the wonderful team I got to work with on this. Roadhouse was founded in 2009. We're up to about 90 really talented people building a whole bunch of mobile games right now. The Carnage team itself was around 12 to 14 people working on any given time. We peaked at around 20 people just before launch. We get to compete with them now. That's going to be really fun. Within our own team, we had a whole bunch of people that had worked on 40K titles in the past. This included Dawn of War, Space Marine, and a lot more of the people on our team were big 40K fans. So pretty cool. So obviously game design is all about problem solving, and in the course of developing this game, some of that problem solving worked out really good, and sometimes it didn't work out so well. So we're going to cover a couple things with that. We're also going to deep dive into one of the larger challenges that we faced in this project, and that was the timeline constraints that we had. So to kind of give some context on the timeline constraints, this project was 18 months in length, but it had some really unique challenges. It was ramped up very, very quickly for a prototype. It was then shelved for a few months. And then rebooted again with a completely different design direction. Then our final development timeline was extended quite a bit longer than we had originally planned for. And while this gave us a lot more time to polish, it also caused us to overreach with a bunch of features. But I'll deep dive into this timeline stuff at the end of the presentation and kind of cover a bit more of that then. So really, with Carnage, we wanted to go broad. We wanted to have a large audience enjoy this game, even if they didn't know the difference between a squig and a grot. So a lot of inspiration came from the games we played as kids. And so Mega Man, Metal Slug, Super Metroid, Contra. Our aim is really to take this classic gameplay style and meld it with the mechanics and systems that were working really well on mobile. And so we focused on three key areas. We really wanted to have a solid action experience. We wanted to have super satisfying and very visceral action. We also wanted to have some really deep character customization and progression, and that's what we surfaced in our War Gear system in the game. And finally, we wanted to have a really deep world with a lot of exploration, so players who came back to the game would be able to see some new things later on down the road. And of course, because it was a 40K game, we had to stay true to the IP. We knew that existing 40K fans were going to be critical to getting the word out about our game, and so we had to ensure that we were being authentic to their beloved IP. So we'll talk first about our content pipeline. And there were a few things that really fed into this pipeline, and that was IP authenticity, a really optimized art pipeline. We needed to have a high reusability of assets, and we had to minimize our tech risk. Early on the project, we were very artist heavy and engineer light, and so anything we could do to reduce tech burden at the early point in our project was taken. So when we're looking at our visual style, we needed to look at having a readability at small sizes. It's great. That's awesome. I can only think about the Weird Al song in my head now when I hear this one, right? So good. So given our genre, we had to have our characters very small on screen, and so we needed to have it very readable at that small size. We also need to have really great deal at full screen. We have camera moments where the character is much larger, and we have the character being used on full screen UI elements. We wanted to have the same character used on all aspects of the game. This is really distracting. And we also had to have a really learnable art technique. We had artists rolling on and off the project, and we had to ensure that our pipeline was allowed to get artists ramped up very quickly so they can produce art quickly. So thankfully, we were able to learn from painting techniques that Games Workshop has been optimizing for many decades. So their miniatures obviously look really, really great at small sizes and also look really fantastic when they're up close. They've devised a painting technique that actually really brings that out and brings out the detail in those models. So we focused on big lines, really bold colors, and really strong silhouettes to ensure that our characters look really, really great at small sizes, but also very large. So here you can kind of see on the left what our models look like in our early prototype phase, and then on the right kind of where we ended up. Early on, we went for a lot more of a grittier look before we actually nailed down our cleaner, harder lines and brighter color look. And the way we created our character models was driven by a timeline and our timeline constraints and really a desire for these iconic character designs. So in our early prototype, we tried to make the development of characters really, really fast. We tried to use some stitching technology that would allow us to create a standard model that would then be stitched with textures to create any kind of Space Marine we wanted. But we really weren't satisfied with this. Although it would have led to a very, very fast art pipeline, it wasn't giving us the customization we really needed, and the tech really wasn't where we wanted it to be. So we just decided to alleviate the tech risk and just go completely handcrafted for these models. Our artist was actually super happy about this. He's a huge 40K fan, and when I got to tell him that all he had to do for the next few months was draw out 40K character models, he was pretty stoked about that. So it was a pretty big win for that. What we had to do, though, was we had to be very clear up front on how many characters we were hoping for, and we had to really work on getting that art pipeline really, really tight, because now we had increased the manual labor on our art there quite a bit. When we were building war gear, we also wanted to go for a more generic look. We tried to make war gear archetypes that could be used across all character classes. But the problem is, in the 40K universe, there's lots of special cases. So for example, the bolt gun. For all characters, it's fine to have a black casing on it, but the Dark Angel requires a red casing on it. When you're looking at the Lightning Claw and the Power Fist, same sort of thing. You have to have the markings and the colors associated with the character at any given time. So although we tried to stay generic with our war gear archetypes, we had to have a system in place where we could override them with character-specific models. So obviously at this point, our art pipeline is pretty expensive, and it wouldn't be scalable to hundreds of items that would be necessary to drive the economy of this game. So we had to multiply the use of our art assets. And the primary method we did with this was through an affixes system that we had in the game. And these were design-driven rules that we could apply to gear that could dramatically change their gameplay. These affixes were defensive or offensive and ranged from basic attributes like additional damage to more exotic attributes like damage over time, stun, poison, you name it. This worked out pretty well, and across the 13 different archetypes that we created, we shipped with 500 pieces of war gear. And adding 100 new pieces of war gear is very, very easy. So whenever we do the effort to create a new affix and create a new archetype in the game, it's very easy to add new affixes and generate another 100 new pieces of war gear very rapidly. So in the level design front, we also really needed to optimize our pipeline. Again, our time constraints were huge, but we also needed to focus on a small app size and a small memory footprint. We were targeting our game to be at the 100 megabyte limit for the App Store. The end game was just a little bit over that, but pretty close. And we had to have the game running on the iPad, so that meant fitting within 512 megs of RAM. And so we really needed to keep our texture usage down to a minimum. So our pipeline here was that designers would gray block a sample level. Our artists would then paint over and create some small art pieces on that level, and that's kind of what you see here. These art pieces could then go through the standard approval chain to get them good and kosher to use in game. And they would use these to create prefabbed level segments. And these level segments could then be used by the level designers to create full-on levels, kind of like big Lego pieces to kind of create levels. And those levels, because they're using pre-arted level segments, would be a lot quicker to develop. And they didn't require an additional art pass after the fact. So we did a little bit of upfront work to kind of create these pieces and those segments, but then that allowed us to create more levels a lot quicker. But the consequence of heavy reuse of these art pieces and segments was that we got into some monotonous visuals. So we needed a way to increase the visual variety of our levels, but without increasing our art budget or increasing our tech risk. So our solution was to invest in some lighting rig tech. This was an early sample that one of our artists had put together experimenting with this technology early in the project, and it was actually incredibly easy to implement. It was cheap from a technical perspective, and once implemented, it took our artists about 5 minutes to create a new lighting rig, which could dramatically change the visual variety of each of the levels. We ended up shipping with about 13 different lighting rigs, which we spread across the 50 levels. So that was visuals. Now we'll get into some gameplay and loops. One of the hardest design problems was how you build responsive controls that could handle action platforming on mobile. So most of us agreed that virtual joysticks didn't work. But we also tried some swipe controls, and we just found that that wasn't as responsive as we wanted it to be. So when you're thinking about classic platformers with physical controls, a player's thumb has this tactile feedback, and that allows them to make these really micro adjustments in their thumb position to hit the buttons correctly. Obviously, that control doesn't work on mobile. You don't have that tactile feedback, and the player ends up having a lot of mispresses. So what we came up with was focusing on 3 distinct thumb positions, and that's horizontal extended, vertical extended, and tucked. And we created the 3 different hit areas based on that. What we found was the muscle changes in your thumb for those 3 positions was distinct enough that a player would always know what they were hitting at any given time. And so we created these hitbox areas that were much larger than the thumb reach to account for small thumbs and big thumbs. What we ended up finding was this worked very, very well. Almost every game player that was trying their game reduced all mispresses and were able to get into a very responsive flow state and stay in that state for a lot of gameplay. I could actually do a whole talk on just all the iteration we did on these controls, but I digress. Another fun design problem was translating the 40K weapon archetypes into an action side-scroller. So obviously 40K weapon archetypes work really well on a tabletop game with strategic stuff, whereas we're a very fast-paced, action-oriented, kind of a 2D side-scroller. We got into some pretty lengthy arguments on our team between our 40K hardcore fans and the designers that really wanted to make a really great side-scrolling experience. And we found that the best way to actually accomplish this was to have our 40K experts describe these weapons, how they felt that they worked, and kind of what was important about them to our non-40K designers. Through this, we were able to kind of hone in on the aspects that really stood out and that mattered the most. And then we were able to create these archetypes that kind of that were influenced by the 40K tabletop, but weren't really committed to the rules that were used on that. We also couldn't afford to have an archetype be better than another. In order to kind of maintain a very large amount of war gear, we needed to have it so that at any point in the game, a player could use any archetype and be effective with it. So we tried to keep them play different, but not necessarily be better than one or another. So there was a lot of balancing work done here to ensure that that happened. So for this example, with the bolt pistol, bolt gun, and storm bolter, in an original prototype, we had these, bolt pistol was less good than the bolt gun, which was less good than the storm bolter. The way we designed this was they're all about the same in terms of the amount of damage they can do, but the storm bolter requires a lot more skill in order to use it. Using different spread rates and using different damage of bullets allowed us to kind of create a little bit of a different feel between these different weapons. So the success of our game was really going to depend on our gear loop. And for a mobile title, we focused on a loop at around 60 to 90 seconds. The character would battle through a level to earn currency and XP. Then currency is used to buy war gear, which can be further upgraded to improve stats, and this allows the player to be more effective in battle. So after we had a solid gameplay experience, we needed a screen to handle these additional 4 loop states. We spent a lot of time on this war gear screen. It's displayed after every single level and acts as a store, an inventory manager, and a character manager. We really needed the screen to be efficient and make the process of buying, equipping, and upgrading war gear really rewarding. So our design of the screen was based off of 3 different columns. On the far right is stuff you could have, it's basically rewards or stuff you could buy. Stuff in the middle is stuff you own but you're not currently using. And on the far left is your character and the stuff that you have equipped. Early designs of the screen had a lot of tabs and pop-ups to manage the different various tasks that you had to handle, but we found that this just took too much time and was a little bit too difficult for the player to get through. Really, by focusing on this iteration, focusing on iterating the screen to the point where we got it to allowed us for the player to get into the screen, buy some gear, upgrade their gear, and equip their gear within just a couple of seconds. Now, although we did wireframe many iterations of the screen, we were still forced to start development on it a little bit earlier than I would have liked. And then as the project dates were pushed out, we continually went through more rounds of iteration after the screen had already been built. This was very expensive. I would have preferred that we could have done that iteration back in the gray block phase instead of in a fully completed UI phase. Right, so those were things that I think went really good. Here's going to be a thing that I didn't think went so good at all. So since we had handcrafted each of those 50 levels, cool, thank you. Since we had handcrafted those 50 levels, we really needed a way to extend playability. So we designed 2 features to do this. Feature 1 was game modes. This was a single-player feature that allowed a player to replay a level with different systems and changes. It would change it to like have a meteor strike or a poisonous atmosphere or more dangerous enemies in it. Allowed them to play through a level 3 different times and earn additional stars through it. The second feature we built was the Fire Team Missions mode. This was a social feature that allowed a player to team up with a buddy and work through a level and accomplish a goal through that level. Both these features were started way after our originally intended alpha date, and our timeline constraints made us really rush the designs. So development was sluggish because a non-well-formed design was there, and the end result was a couple of features that players had a really hard time understanding. So since our original launch, we've improved the UI around the game modes feature, so the players can understand a little bit more. They get a better sense of how many stars they have in the overall node, and it's made it a lot better since we first went out. We're planning to do the same thing with Fire Team missions, but of course this post-release iteration is incredibly expensive, and it really would have done us well to just ignore these features since they were coming in late, and really take the time to design them properly up front. So really the key learning here was to be careful with adding new features late in the project, especially when the team should have just been focusing on polishing and bug fixing of the core feature set. So I promised to deep dive into the timeline challenges here. And as mentioned earlier, timeline was a big constraint through this entire project. So while the total project length was 18 months, this wasn't a very stable 18 months. It was a very, very turbulent time. Shortly after the start of development, Roadhouse had lost one of our larger clients. And since we were funding Carnage internally, this proved very problematic. So we knew we wanted to invest in this game. We knew that as a studio, we were pivoting to mobile, and we wanted to have this as a great title that we could release on it. So we dove in hard. We put a huge team on this project and built a really great prototype before we ran out of money. So last summer, we had to hibernate the game. We had to put it on ice while the rest of us focused on other studio priorities. Meanwhile, we were looking to secure some additional funding for development. By August, Roadhouse was getting back into stable footing, and we started to scale the team back up. We polished up the prototype, and we changed the core gameplay. In the earlier prototype, we were actually building more of an auto-runner style game, and we really did change the game at this moment in time to be more of a classical side-scroller game. We felt that it had a lot more depth to it, but this was obviously a lot of work to change that. To add to that pressure, we also decided that we were going to do a public demo at Games Day, which is a Games Workshop fan event, and we'd get to show Carnage to all the Warhammer 40K fans. So we basically had a 2-month time window of restarting the project, getting a new team online for it, getting all the tech out of Freezer, cleaning it all up, building the new design around our new kind of mantra of what we wanted to, and getting into a publicly demoable state. This was crazy. This was an almost impossible goal, yet we somehow pulled it off. The response from Games Day was incredible. The fans loved the game and really liked where we were going with it. And so this gave us some huge confidence, and it really gave us the inertia we needed to push towards our expected release date in early 2014. So we set a very aggressive milestone schedule for us, which we hit, and we had an early alpha candidate ready in January. But around this time, we really evaluated the quality, and we found that it was good, but it just wasn't as great as we thought it could be. The game was looking incredibly promising, so we made the decision to invest even further and move the release date out. So the problem with this phase, though, is we got a little bit too excited. We didn't just spend time polishing. We spent time adding new features, and that was a big thing that hurt us, as we touched on in the game modes and Fire Team missions area. We worked on features that we never had any hope of finishing to the quality level we wanted. We really should have just focused on polishing, because the polishing work we did in this phase was amazing. We really brought the game from an okay standpoint to a really great standpoint. And it paid off. So Carnage was released on iOS in May, and then Android in June. We were featured across 70 countries on the iOS store, and we're out in 100 different countries right now. We got strong reviews from both media and fans. We're definitely happy with how things have worked out. We're now planning monthly releases of content. The first content release came out just this month. It's called the Dark Angels release. And each of these releases, we're theming around a special Space Marine chapter. We have new features, new levels in each of those. This last release has some great, strong KPIs behind it, so we're very excited. So definitely, while our road to launch definitely wasn't smooth, I think we delivered a pretty solid experience that our broad audience is enjoying, and we're definitely encouraged and happy to be continuing development on this.